seminar. It's a transportation seminar series, and I'm really pleased that we have with us today Professor Cynthia Chen, and she's not going to be with us just today. She is on a 3-week visit as part of her sabbatical, so we have the privilege and honor of hosting Professor Cynthia Chen for several weeks, and I hope many of you will take the opportunity to meet with her, interact with her, and catch up on research of mutual interest. To say a few things about Professor Cynthia Chen, who some of us have known for a very, very long time. She did her education at a bunch of schools, but the one that really matters is that she did her PhD at the University of California at Davis. Well, and she was a student of Professor Patricia Markarian during her days at Davis, and was, I think, perhaps the last UC Davis PhD student with the late Professor Luigi Kuromura.
In the U.S.
In the U.S., exactly, so at Davis. So certainly after that, she was a tenured faculty member at the City University of New York, City College of New York, CCNY. And after that, in 2009, she moved to the University of Washington, Seattle, where she's been a faculty member ever since, yes. So a lot of connections, obviously. Cynthia has worked extensively in travel behavior analysis, travel behavior modeling, activity and time use patterns of individuals. So she's made quite a name for herself in that arena. But interestingly, she's also very cleverly and creatively somewhat reinvented herself in the past few years, working in the larger space of urban resilience. And so today, she's going to kind of combine some of her insights into human activities and travel, along with the whole question of urban resilience. And so we look forward to her presentation. So thank you, and I'll
Thank you, Ron. Thanks, Ron, for the nice introduction. I'm not sure whether it's this reinvention is out of creativity, but it's also out of some of our constraints in Seattle. So anyway, I found my connections to people in the audience through my undergraduate institution, graduate institution, as well as my current institution. So so it's a great honor for me to be here. Anyway, so this is one of the first studies after I moved into this newer area in the past few years, and it's essentially looking at the resiliency of communities, and now we are also looking at resiliency of multiple infrastructure systems that go beyond transportation system. But this particular talk is not looking at multiple systems, it's only looking at transportation systems. Okay. So this is going to be my outline. I'm going to do a little bit of motivation and review of the current work, methodology, data, and some of our results, as well as I will talk about contributions, what this study's contribution is. And of course, my PhD student who's not here did all the hard work. so this is the motivation, right? So this is Carrie Emanuel in 2013's paper, and basically looking at the intensity as well as the frequency of hurricanes in storms, basically, in North America. And so the topograph is frequency, and so all the way going to 2095. And so the paper was done in 2012, and so all the years after 2012 was simulated based on simulation models, but the previous years were based on the actual observations. And so the idea of this figure is essentially saying that we are facing more and more frequent tropical storms. And the intensity, so this is looking at sort of the power, they calculated this power dissipation index, which is sort of a function of wind speed and duration And so it can be viewed as the intensity of the storm, and that is predicted to be increasing for the next 100 years or so. So this is kind of the larger motivation for this particular study, and of course many other studies in the field. So when, I guess, transportation researchers think about disasters, the first thing we think about, or they think about, I don't know, is evacuation, right? And evacuation is only actually one of the many things that happen during this process. And so hurricanes, for example, now this is Hurricane Irene, and this was taken, I think, in New York City, and this is the 2005 the Houston case. So, this is so essentially that when we are talking about hurricanes and those tropical storms, and there are different kinds of disaster, and this particular storm, hurricanes we viewed as notice events, meaning that there is official warnings coming out, and then people became aware of it and then take actions. So there are many studies in the field, and there are also quite a number of assumptions, right? Looking at, okay, how people became aware of it after the official warning, and then how people take actions. And all of the assumptions, and in fact, almost all the simulation models used for policy analysis are based on this linear sequential process, which says official warnings come out first, and then awareness, and then followed by actions. And it makes a lot of sense, but there has been no empirical verifications about this timing events, the timing of these events sequentially. And also, most of the studies, almost all studies talking about disaster responses were at individual and household level. So for this particular research, we are more sort of interested, first of all, we are interested in this process, okay? Whether it is indeed a linear process or perhaps it may be not. And also, we want to develop a methodology that will allow us to detect the timing of the awareness as well as action. So essentially, we are asking the question is that can we use some public data that detect when the public became aware, significantly aware of the warning, and when the public started to take actions, right? And now these actions are not necessarily just evacuations. And so, so that's also what we are interested in, and also we are not interested in the individual and household level, we are interested at a mass level. So we are saying that given a warning is issued to a region, can we detect at the mass level? Okay. So these are the three things that we are particularly interested in, and that is our research goal. So a little bit of current work, and there has been a lot of studies and, in sociology, and in fact, sociologists is one of the first group of researchers that looking at disaster responses. So many frameworks have been proposed, for example, and I just list actually three prominent ones by several well-known sociologists who work on disaster research. And all of these frameworks, again, focus looking at the individual or household level. So these frameworks, so this is also based on two sociologists in the field, that all of these frameworks can be unified into sort of three stages, right? And first you have warning disseminated by the officials, and then secondly, that people have psychological responses. And this is the stage where we call it awareness. And the last one is the behavior responses. And again, behavior responses is not just evacuations. And so this is sort of the three steps that we are interested in looking at. So what is awareness? And so essentially, awareness can actually include a lot of psychological responses by individuals and people there. And so basically, I mean, there has been also a lot of literature in this particular area too, but essentially that people feel anything that is before the actual actions were taken place is, we just lump all of them as psychological responses, and in this particular study that we view them as just awareness. So awareness is everything that happens before the actual actions were taken, after the warning stage. So again, that there are quite many challenges in terms of trying to detect this awareness. And a lot of that goes to the challenges on data. And so, because it's very hard to obtain data to study awareness, and people now, most of the sociological studies actually on disasters, they usually do those rapid surveys, right? A lot of them, for example, were actually funded by NSF, and they actually, right after a disaster happens, strikes, they go into the field immediately, and those surveys are called rapid surveys. And so they are, again, post-disaster surveys, and done in a fairly small sample size, and because we are interested in detecting those timings at the mass level, so we want to be able to use a data source that will potentially provide us with real-time capabilities, okay? So this is, actually we're gonna use the social media data, okay? So there are different kinds of social media data, and in my field, many people have used, for example, also, for example, mobile phone data too. I see Bill King, right, who handles all of those ASH data. But this study does not use any of the ASH data, and because we think that the social media data, for example, the Twitter data, is probably more resilient, okay, as opposed to data from cell phones in a disaster context. Because with cell phones, you need cell towers. That, for example, during 911, most of the Verizon towers in New York City were down. And so with social media, for example, Twitter data, people can tweet, on cell phones, but they can also do it on computers. So it is a little bit more resilient. And it's also, the other big advantage is that it's free, right? It's public, that Bill King will not give you the data for free. So that's another big advantage that we use, particularly for this study. Twitter data, it's public and it's free. And it's real time, and we can scrape it. So that's a reason. Now, we did actually both, and there have been studies that people have also, especially computer science people and information folks, they have used Twitter data as well. They have also used Twitter data for disaster studies, but all of them were looking at individual, especially their studies more focusing on emergency responders, where emergency responders were not of our interest in this study. We are interested in the public, okay? And so, but both content analysis and network-based analysis have done, and they were also both used for this study too. Okay, so, and so I talked about this already, so I can repeat. And so there have been, in recent years, there have been a few studies looking at sort of a broader view than just evacuation. And so, so these are listed. And so actually Dan work of UIUC is a collaborator of mine, and he also, we actually worked on this paper together. So this is looking at how, for example, overall on the region level, how travel time, travel distance may have changed. And one study, well, a few studies looking at how the trip origins and destinations were, how their distributions were changed. Okay, now most of these studies were I mean, these studies are great, but most of them were limited in a way that they were only looking at a relatively narrow, narrow snapshot, so right after disaster, as opposed to we want to go from, for this particular study, we want to kind of take the whole life cycle view, is that from looking at before disaster to during and then after, so more sort of a complete timeline. Okay, so I'm going to just give a brief overview of the methodology. So the methodologies here, we have warnings, awareness, and actions, right? And so these are the definitions that I've already talked about. So to detect warning, to detect awareness, we use social media Twitter data. And for actions, we actually use two very, very conventional transportation data sets. One is subway riderships, and this is New York City with Hurricane Sandy. And the other one is the taxi data. The taxi data for New York City is actually also public. And so we construct on the social media data, because people replying with each other, right? So we construct social interaction networks, okay? So this is our metrics. And for this, that to detect those changes, that we actually develop one metric, which is what we call assortativity, which is a metric coming from the network science, but we put flows onto it. Because most of the network science stuff are only structure-based or topological-based and not flow-based. Okay. So this is, yeah, so I talk about this, constructs and the metrics. So awareness, and it's just a bit more that what we, so our metrics is basically looking at the structures of online social networks and how they change, right? Now that is supposedly to capture how people interact from each other, right? From before to during and then after disaster. And because that we feel that, and you know, who people contact, and as well as how many contacts they have, and so they change over time from before to during and after disaster, and that gives us the signals on how people's awareness might have changed. So that's the idea. So we look at two dimensions, okay, of the metrics. So I think I need to move here a little bit more. It's, one is looking at the amount of interaction, okay, how many interactions. The second one is looking at how the interactions are distributed. Okay, so that's, so whether I keep still interacting with my normal circle, or I change the people who I interact with. And now this is motivated by several studies in the area, and so for example, that a few years ago by Barresi of Northeastern University, they took out the cell phone data and looked at the Boston bombing, and they found that people change their interaction patterns when, as soon as the bombing happens. Well, that's an unnoticed event, right? And guess who people call the most right after the bombing? It's their mother. People usually never interact with their mother or not on a regular basis, but as soon as that happens, that a lot of people were calling their mother. And so that's kind of, there's some empirical evidence for that. So this is looking at what we call motif, okay? Motif is, well, not what we call. Motif is a very well-known concept in network science. It's basically can be viewed as a skeleton of structures, the most elementary structure that if you put multiple motifs together, it builds a pattern. So think of that way. And so we look at basically two kinds, and one is what we call dyadic motifs, okay? So one, node link, meaning that there's no interaction, right? Each node represents a user, and this is one link dyad. And we also, so this is looking at the amount of the interaction. And then the second metric is we're looking at the triadic motifs, and so this is essentially looking at how these interactions were distributed right? So if you look at this one, this is the interaction among a fairly closed circle, right? And as opposed to, for example, this one will be more broader interaction as opposed to just within a small circle, right? So we're looking at changes of those motifs over time, and so that's the idea. And as people change, so for example, in the Boston bombing example, that usually that people might be interacting with their friends all the time, and now maybe after bombing that the interaction becomes a little bit broader. So the mother is not within this small circle, now it comes into play. So that's the basic idea. One potential problem is that because of the Twitter data, that the number of Twitter users every day is very different, right? And so we have to control that because the number of motifs, whether it's dyadic or triadic motifs, would change actually, and how they distribute it would change depending on how many nodes that are active on any day. So they are different. And so we control that with a use of non-model. So essentially that every day you have different number of users that interact with each other, right? And to control that for every day, we created 2,000 non-models. Okay, so the non-model, its essentially idea is that it's a random graph, okay, but we have key properties controlled. Okay, so for example, that the key property controlled for the dyadic motifs is the number of nodes. Okay, so then everything else being random. Okay, so this is kind of search as a benchmark. So our results are not contaminated just because there are different users interacting every day. So then, once we create this null model, so 2,000 null models where we can calculate both the mean and the standard deviations, right, of our metric, then we just calculate a z-score. So essentially we are seeing that how our observed interaction patterns are different